CEO mocked the poor girl who applied for his receptionist job. She said one sentence, and he went pale. The single sheet of heavy, cream-colored paper fluttered from Conrad Montgomery's manicured fingers. It drifted through the frigid, heavily conditioned air of the Montgomery Tower lobby, landing with a soft, pathetic slap against the cold Italian marble floor. Outside the soaring, floor-to-ceiling glass windows, a heavy, freezing rain lashed against the city skyline, the storm perfectly mirroring the bitter, suffocating tension inside the cavernous room. Conrad adjusted the cuffs of his $5,000 charcoal Brioni suit, a cruel, deeply satisfied smirk playing on his lips. He was a man who had not looked at a price tag in over 11 years, and he certainly did not look at the woman standing before him as anything more than a momentary source of amusement for his board of directors. The massive lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish, expensive jasmine cologne, and the sharp, metallic tang of ruthless corporate power. Josephine Caldwell stood completely still. She was an island of quiet dignity in a sea of unchecked arrogance. She wore a modest, slightly worn charcoal wool coat, a garment that successfully hid the flawlessly tailored, decades-old bespoke silk dress beneath it. Resting quietly against her collarbone, suspended on a delicate chain, was a single, antique silver key. She did not scream. She did not beg. She did not stoop to his pettiness. A receptionist, Conrad mocked, his voice echoing off the high, golden-lit walls, dripping with venomous condescension. You walked into my building, bypassing my multi-million-dollar security system with shoes that look like they belong in a charity bin, and you expect to manage my front desk. A ripple of sycophantic laughter drifted from the senior executives standing behind him. They were wolves in expensive tailoring, eager to feast on whatever scrap their CEO tossed them. They were entirely obsessed with status, absolutely convinced that this quiet woman was entirely beneath them. Josephine said nothing. She did not need to. The silence she gave him then was the most expensive thing he had ever received. A quiet heroine who does not raise her voice is more terrifying to the villain than any screaming opponent. Conrad stepped closer, invading her space, reeking of blind arrogance. "Pick it up," he ordered, gesturing lazily to her resume on the floor. "Consider it your first and only task for the Montgomery Corporation. Hi, my beautiful story family. Welcome home to Mr. James Stories. How are you doing today? I want you to drop a heart in the comments below, just so I know you are here with me, safe and sound. May peace return to you today, and may your struggles shrink in the face of hope. If no one has told you today, you are precious. Let us set all that aside and dive into another story together. Now back to the story." Conrad's sneer deepened as the heavy silence stretched dangerously between them. The Montgomery Tower was a monolith of modern greed, a soaring spike of glass and steel that pierced the gray, weeping sky. Conrad believed he owned the world because his name was plastered in massive, illuminated silver letters behind the grand reception desk. He expected her to crumble under the weight of his authority. He expected her to drop to her knees on the cold marble and gather her papers in shame. If he had looked more carefully at her expression, he might have turned back. He did not look carefully. Little did he know, the very ground he stood upon was about to collapse beneath his Italian leather shoes. Josephine's dark eyes locked onto his. There was no fear in them, only a profound, chilling pity. Her dignity was an impenetrable armor. Every detail of her quiet composure was a subtle clue, a whisper of immense, generational power that the arrogant bully standing before her was far too blind to see. She was the silence before the storm, the devastating calm of a woman who was always 3 moves ahead. Behind Conrad, Arthur, the oldest and longest-serving member of the board, shifted uncomfortably. His pale eyes darted from Conrad's aggressive posture to the quiet woman in the worn coat. His gaze caught the dull gleam of the antique silver key resting at her throat, and then drifted down to the heavy cream paper on the floor. He recognized the heavy stock. He recognized the watermark. Arthur's grip tightened on his Mont Blanc pen, a strange, cold dread beginning to pool in his stomach. He swallowed hard, suddenly feeling as though the temperature in the room had dropped 10 degrees. "Are you deaf, or just stupid?" Conrad snapped, losing his patience. He hated when people didn't cower. "I said pick it up." The tension in the grand lobby reached an unbearable breaking point. The unresolved collision between his arrogance and her hidden reality felt inevitable, looming over the room like a heavy shadow. Josephine finally moved. She did not look down at the paper. She did not lower her chin by even a fraction of an inch. Instead, she stepped forward, the antique silver key catching the dim light. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her eyes piercing straight through his hollow pride, as her lips parted to speak. The words did not come. Not yet. She let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, because the trap had not yet fully closed. To understand the absolute devastation of the sentence resting on Josephine's tongue, one must understand how she had arrived on the 75th floor of the Montgomery Tower 30 minutes earlier. The tower's ground floor lobby was a fortress of modern paranoia. Conrad Montgomery had spent over $3 million outfitting the entrance with state-of-the-art biometric scanners, facial recognition cameras, and a private security force composed entirely of ex-military personnel. Visiting executives from Fortune 500 companies were routinely made to wait in the cold, rain-slicked queue outside, stripped of their dignity before they were ever allowed to scan a temporary visitor's badge. Josephine had not waited. 30 minutes earlier, she had walked through the revolving glass doors, shaking the freezing rain from her charcoal wool coat. She did not approach the massive reception desk. She did not ask for a badge. With the quiet, deliberate grace of a woman walking through her own living room, she bypassed the queue of nervous interns and arrogant vice presidents, heading straight for the private, gold-plated elevator reserved exclusively for the Montgomery family. Two armed security guards immediately stepped into her path, their hands resting on their utility belts. "Ma'am, you need to step back," the taller one barked, his voice echoing off the high, golden-lit walls. "This is a restricted access point." She said nothing. She did not need to. She simply kept walking. As she crossed the invisible threshold of the laser security grid, the entire ground floor braced for the blaring wail of the intrusion alarms. But the alarms did not sound. Instead, the biometric scanners scanned her face, read the thermal signature of her presence, and instantly flashed a solid, glowing emerald green. It was a master override sequence. The heavy glass security doors slid open with a soft, deferential hiss. From his elevated surveillance desk, the chief of security, a man who had guarded the building for 25 years, froze. He stared at his monitors, his face draining of all color. He recognized that specific green override code. It had not been triggered in half a century. Little did he know, this decision would haunt the Montgomery family for the rest of their lives. As the gold elevator doors closed behind Josephine, carrying her up to Conrad's private floor, the security chief did not call for backup. He did not radio his men. Instead, with hands shaking so violently he could barely hold the receiver, he reached for his desk phone and frantically dialed a heavily restricted, unlisted number. On the 75th floor, the rain battered the floor-to-ceiling windows with escalating violence. Conrad's cruel, arrogant laughter filled the executive boardroom lobby, completely ignorant of the security breach that had brought the woman before him. "Did you hear me?" Conrad sneered, his $5,000 suit catching the dim light as he leaned forward, invading her personal space. "I told you to pick up your pathetic resume. Or do you need me to call housekeeping to bring you a broom?" Another round of sycophantic chuckles bubbled up from the junior executives standing behind him. They were entirely focused on impressing their billionaire boss, blind to the storm gathering right in front of them. But Arthur was not laughing. Arthur was the oldest board member in the Montgomery Corporation. He had served Conrad's father and Conrad's grandfather before him. He knew the buried secrets that built the glass monolith they stood inside. And as Arthur stared at the quiet, dignified woman standing before them, his pale blue eyes locked onto the delicate chain resting against her collarbone. It was an antique silver key. The metal was dark with age, intricately carved with a crest of two overlapping oak leaves. Arthur's breathing stopped. The heavy, conditioned air of the penthouse suddenly felt as though it had been sucked from the room. He knew that key. He had seen it exactly once, 40 years ago, in the hands of the true landowner when the original 99-year lease was signed. He had thought the bloodline was entirely extinct. He had thought they were safe. He thought he had won, but he would understand later. Much later, when it was already too late. Arthur's gaze darted in sheer panic from the silver key down to the heavy, cream-colored paper Conrad had so arrogantly kicked onto the floor. It wasn't standard printer paper. It was heavy, archival-quality vellum, watermarked with the same overlapping oak leaves. It wasn't a resume. Arthur's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The room spun. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist felt like an anchor dragging him under. His fingers went entirely numb, losing their grip on his solid gold Montblanc pen. It slipped from his trembling hand, plummeting toward the floor. Clack! The sharp, sudden sound of the heavy gold pen striking the cold Italian marble echoed like a gunshot through the silent lobby. The junior executives turned, confused by the sudden noise from the usually composed elder statesman of the board. Conrad barely glanced over his shoulder, his face twisting in irritation. "For God's sake, Arthur, get a grip on yourself," he snapped, completely dismissing the old man's terror. It was a fatal mistake. If he had looked more carefully at the absolute horror contorting Arthur's weathered face, he might have turned back and begged for his life. He did not look carefully. Meanwhile, across the city, the true machinery of Josephine's long-game revenge was already clicking flawlessly into place. Conrad turned his attention back to Josephine, stepping so close she could smell the cloying, expensive jasmine cologne radiating from his skin. He was furious that she had not flinched. He was terrified of her silence, though his massive ego would never allow him to admit it. "I am losing my patience," Conrad whispered, his voice dropping to a menacing, venomous hiss. "You have exactly 5 seconds to get on your knees and clean up your mess before I have my guards drag you out of this building by your hair." Josephine did not lower her chin. She did not break eye contact. Her dark eyes remained perfectly calm, reflecting the storm raging outside the glass behind him. She possessed a quiet, untouchable power, an elegant certainty that made Conrad's threats sound like the tantrums of a spoiled child. She did not look at the paper on the floor. Instead, her gaze drifted past his shoulder, moving toward the corner of the grand, sprawling lobby. There, standing against the marble wall, was an enormous antique grandfather clock. It was a beautiful, towering relic of dark mahogany and brass, the only piece of furniture in the ultramodern building that had belonged to the original estate. Josephine watched the brass pendulum swing with a hypnotic, inevitable rhythm. The intricate hands on the face of the clock clicked into place. It was exactly 2:58 p.m. The heavy brass pendulum of the antique grandfather clock sliced through the suffocating tension of the lobby, its rhythmic ticking the only sound besides the relentless, freezing rain battering the floor-to-ceiling glass. The ornate hands clicked into place. 2:58. The air in the Montgomery Tower penthouse lobby felt unnaturally thin, smelling sharply of ozone, expensive jasmine cologne, and the brittle, fragile ego of a man who believed he owned the world. Conrad Montgomery stood with his shoulders squared, his tailored Brioni suit immaculate, waiting for the woman before him to break. He thrived on the humiliation of others. It was a sport to him, a necessary exercise of power to remind the wolves in his boardroom who the alpha was. He expected tears. He expected a trembling apology. He expected her to drop to her knees against the freezing Italian marble and scrape her ruined resume from the floor. Josephine Caldwell did none of these things. Her dark eyes remained perfectly composed, an endless, tranquil ocean that refused to reflect his storm. Her dignity was absolute, a quiet, unyielding force that was beginning to make the junior executives shift uncomfortably in their handmade Italian leather shoes. "May I make one phone call?" Josephine asked. Her voice was velvet over steel, quiet but impossibly clear, carrying effortlessly across the cavernous, golden-lit space. She did not ask for permission to retrieve the paper. She did not acknowledge his degrading command. Conrad let out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. "A phone call," he sneered, his lips twisting into a cruel, patronizing smile. "Who are you calling, sweetheart? A taxi back to whatever damp basement you crawled out of? Or perhaps your mother, to cry about how mean the corporate world is?" The sycophantic laughter from the board members swelled again, though it sounded slightly more forced this time. The old man, Arthur, was still staring in absolute, paralyzed horror at the silver key resting against Josephine's collarbone, his breathing ragged and shallow. "Go ahead," Conrad mocked, gesturing expansively with a manicured hand. "Make your little phone call. I want to see this. But when you hang up, You are going to get on your knees and pick up your garbage. Little did he know, the brief phone call she was about to make would dismantle his entire empire and sever his access to billions in exactly 60 minutes. Josephine did not reach for a cracked, inexpensive smartphone. From the deep pocket of her worn charcoal coat, she withdrew a sleek, matte black satellite device, the kind of encrypted hardware utilized exclusively by heads of state and elite private intelligence firms. Conrad's cruel smile faltered for a fraction of a second as he recognized the device, a sudden, cold prickle of unease brushing against the back of his neck. She pressed a single button. She did not bring the device to her ear. She simply held it in her palm. The silence in the lobby deepened, stretching into an agonizing void. The grandfather clock clicked again. The heavy, resonant chime of the clock striking 3 o'clock vibrated through the marble floors, ringing out exactly 3 times. On the final chime, the encrypted phone in Josephine's hand connected. A crisp, deeply professional voice echoed softly but clearly from the speaker. "The transfer is complete, ma'am. You are clear." The encrypted device clicked dead. Josephine slipped it fluidly back into the pocket of her damp wool coat. She had not spoken a single word to the person on the other end of the line, yet an undeniable shift had just occurred in the atmosphere of the room. The power dynamic had invisibly, irreversibly fractured. Conrad swallowed hard, a drop of cold sweat suddenly forming at his temple despite the heavily conditioned air. His brain furiously tried to rationalize what he had just witnessed. It was a trick, he told himself. A pathetic, elaborate bluff from a desperate woman trying to save face in front of the wealthiest men in the city. He forced the arrogant sneer back onto his face, stepping aggressively forward until he was mere inches from her. "Are we done playing games?" Conrad hissed, his voice dropping its theatrical volume, turning lethal and quiet. "Because I am entirely out of patience. Pick the paper up. Now." He thought he had won, but the game had not even begun. Josephine looked at him with that same profound, devastating pity. She did not look down. Instead, she raised her hands, her movements deliberate and terrifyingly calm, and reached for the topmost button of her worn, charcoal gray outer coat. Conrad frowned, his brow furrowing in deep confusion. "What are you doing? I didn't tell you to get comfortable." With a soft, heavy rustle, Josephine undid the final button and let the damp wool coat slide from her shoulders. It pooled on the pristine marble floor, completely forgotten. The breath was collectively sucked from the lungs of every executive in the room. Beneath the unassuming coat, Josephine was not wearing the cheap, ill-fitting attire of a desperate job applicant. She wore a dress of absolute, breathtaking mastery. It was crafted from heavy, midnight sapphire silk that seemed to drink in the golden hour light filtering through the storm clouds outside. The tailoring was flawless, hugging her frame with the kind of precision that could not be purchased off any rack in the world. There were no visible seams, no brand labels, no flashy logos. It was quiet, generational wealth woven directly into fabric. Conrad was a man obsessed with status and luxury. He practically lived at Sotheby's and exclusive private tailors in Milan. His eye for expensive things was the sharpest tool he possessed, and right now, that tool was violently betraying him. His arrogant sneer vanished entirely, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of profound bewilderment. He recognized the drape of the fabric. He recognized the impossibly intricate, hand-stitched detailing at the cuffs. This was an archival piece of haute couture, the kind of museum-quality garment that only existed in the private, climate-controlled vaults of the world's oldest families. He would understand later, much later, when it was already too late. Conrad's eyes darted frantically over her attire, his heart beginning to hammer a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The devastating truth crashed over him like a wave of ice water. Conrad suddenly realized the silk fabric of her dress is bespoke and worth more than his own suit. The silence in the grand lobby was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of a vacuum, of all oxygen being violently pulled from the space. The junior executives exchanged terrified, confused glances, their previous laughter entirely forgotten. They looked at their billionaire CEO, waiting for him to reassert his dominance. But Conrad was staring at the sapphire silk dress as if it were a loaded weapon pointed directly at his chest. Panic is a dangerous catalyst for an arrogant man. Unable to process the visual contradiction of the priceless vintage silk and the woman he had just degraded, Conrad's ego lashed out in a desperate bid for control. He refused to be intimidated in his own building. "I don't care where you rented that dress," Conrad spat, his voice noticeably lacking its previous booming certainty. It sounded thin, reedy, and laced with panic. "I gave you a direct order." He stepped forward and violently kicked the heavy, cream-colored paper that still rested on the marble floor. His polished Italian leather shoe scuffed the pristine vellum, sending it skidding a few feet away. This decision to let his temper control him would haunt Conrad for the rest of his life. When his shoe struck the paper, the force caused the heavy vellum to flip over, exposing the second page that had previously been hidden against the stone. While Conrad continued to glare at Josephine, trying to intimidate a woman made of iron, Arthur could no longer stand. The oldest board member, his face ashen and slick with cold sweat, felt his knees finally give out. With a soft groan, the elderly man sank to the floor, his expensive suit wrinkling against the cold marble. "Arthur," one of the vice presidents whispered, stepping forward to help the old man. "Sir, are you having a medical episode?" Arthur waved the man off with a violently trembling hand. He did not care about his pride. He did not care about the dirt on the floor. He was crawling on his hands and knees toward the heavy cream paper Conrad had just kicked away. The paper was not a resume. It had never been a resume. Arthur's pale, watery eyes locked onto the thick, black ink on the second page. It was a massive, intricate wax seal, pressed over a signature that carried the weight of a century. It was the original deed of land, drafted 99 years ago, the very foundation upon which the Montgomery Corporation's glass tower had been built. And beneath the archaic legal text, signed in fresh, bold ink, was the name of the sole living heir. Arthur leaned down, his nose inches from the paper, his entire body shaking as he read the signature on the fallen paper, and gasped for air. The silence in the penthouse lobby stretched until it felt as though the heavy, conditioned air might shatter like cheap glass. Old Arthur remained on his hands and knees against the freezing Italian marble, his chest heaving as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. He stared at the thick, black ink of the signature on the fallen vellum, his mind violently rewinding through decades of buried corporate secrets. Conrad Montgomery, entirely blind to the catastrophic revelation unfolding at his feet, sneered at the old man. "Get up, Arthur," he commanded, his voice sharp with embarrassment. He hated weakness. He despised anything that disrupted the immaculate, aggressive image of his corporation. "You are making a fool of yourself in front of the help." Josephine Caldwell did not look at the gasping old man, nor did she look at the billionaire barking orders. Her calm, dark eyes drifted toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the freezing rain lash against the reinforced glass. She was not looking at the city skyline. She was looking down, past the 75 floors of steel and vanity, to the earth buried deep beneath the concrete foundation. Decades ago, long before the Montgomery name had ever bought its way into high society, this exact coordinate of land had been a sprawling, green estate. It had been Caldwell land. Her grandfather had signed a 99-year commercial lease with Conrad's ruthless grandfather, a lease that had allowed the Montgomery family to build their towering empire under the strict, legally binding condition that the land would one day return to its rightful bloodline. Conrad's grandfather had hidden the lease. Conrad's father had buried it deeper. And Conrad himself had grown up believing the lie that he was a king who owned the very dirt he walked upon. He thought he had won, but he was merely a temporary tenant in a castle he did not own. Josephine took a slow, deliberate breath, the bespoke midnight sapphire silk of her dress shifting softly over her shoulders. She said nothing. She did not need to. The trap had been set generations before she was born. She was simply the one turning the key. "I am speaking to you," Conrad roared, his frustration finally breaking through his arrogant facade. He took a threatening step toward Josephine, his fists clenching at his sides. "I don't care what thrift store you found that dress in. You are trespassing in my building, on my property, and you are going to—" He never finished the sentence. Without warning, the soft, ambient lighting of the penthouse lobby violently snapped off. A split second of total darkness consumed the room, followed immediately by the harsh, strobing glare of crimson emergency lights. Then, The sound hit them. It was a deafening, mechanical wail, the building's catastrophic emergency lockdown sirens beginning to blare. The screech of the lockdown sirens was a physical force, vibrating through the soles of their expensive leather shoes and rattling the crystal decanters on the nearby boardroom bar. The heavy, gold-plated security doors at the far end of the lobby slammed shut with a definitive, echoing boom, locking out the private stairwells. Panic instantly erupted among the junior executives. They scrambled backward, knocking over modern art pedestals and spilling expensive scotch across the marble. They pulled frantically at their collars, their eyes darting to the flashing crimson strobes that painted the room in the color of an emergency. "What is happening?" One of the vice presidents screamed over the mechanical wail, his hands pressed over his ears. Conrad ignored the sirens, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He refused to show fear. He was the CEO. He was the master of this domain. He stormed toward a mahogany wall panel and violently smashed his fist against the emergency intercom button, assuming this was a pathetic system malfunction or a misguided drill by his incompetent security staff. "Security, turn this off immediately," Conrad bellowed into the intercom, the veins in his neck bulging against his starched white collar. "I will fire every single one of you. Turn it off." The intercom remained dead. Only the relentless, deafening wail of the sirens answered him. Little did he know, the email Josephine's encrypted device had sent 3 minutes earlier had completely overridden the tower's mainframe. The security team was not ignoring him. They were entirely locked out of their own system. The building no longer recognized Conrad Montgomery as its master. Furious, Conrad spun back around to face Josephine. The flashing red lights danced across her calm, unreadable features. She had not flinched at the noise. She had not moved a single inch. She stood like a marble statue in the center of the chaos, her hands resting gracefully together in front of her. "This is you," Conrad hissed, marching toward her, his aristocratic mask entirely slipping to reveal the schoolyard bully underneath. He pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at her face. "I don't know how you hacked my system, you pathetic little fraud, but you are going to federal prison for this. I will ruin you. I will grind you into the dirt." He would understand later. Much later, when it was already too late. Over the deafening shriek of the sirens, a new sound cut through the lobby. It was a soft, elegant chime. The heavy, gold-plated doors of the private executive elevator, the one secured by biometric locks that only Conrad possessed, smoothly slid open, and a legion of high-powered attorneys stepped out. The arrival of the legal team was like a bucket of ice water thrown over the blazing panic in the room. There were 6 of them, all wearing immaculate, custom-tailored obsidian suits and carrying heavy leather briefcases. They moved with terrifying, predatory synchronicity, their expressions completely devoid of emotion as they stepped out of the gold elevator and into the strobing red light of the lobby. Conrad stopped his aggressive advance toward Josephine and let out a harsh, breathless laugh of sheer relief. He straightened his Brioni jacket, aggressively pulling on his cuffs to regain his composure. He recognized the man leading the pack. It was Harrison, the senior partner of the most ruthless, expensive corporate defense firm in the city, a firm Conrad kept on a staggering $50 million annual retainer. "Harrison, thank God." Conrad barked over the blaring alarms, a smug, vindictive smirk returning to his face. He shot a look of pure venom at Josephine. "Your timing is impeccable. I want this woman arrested immediately for corporate espionage, cyberterrorism, and trespassing. Do not let her leave this room. Strip her of everything she has." The junior executives behind Conrad visibly relaxed, their terrified murmurs turning into nervous chuckles. The cavalry had arrived. The billionaire had regained control. The poor girl in the bespoke dress was about to be obliterated by the finest legal minds money could buy. Conrad aggressively stepped forward, extending his hand to his lead attorney, expecting the man to shake it and immediately begin barking orders at the authorities. Harrison did not take Conrad's hand. In fact, Harrison did not even look at Conrad. The senior partner's cold, gray eyes swept past the billionaire as if he were nothing more than a minor obstruction on the floor, an irrelevant piece of furniture. This decision to ignore the writing on the wall would haunt Conrad for the rest of his life. Harrison and his 5 towering associates marched uniformly past Conrad's outstretched hand, their heavy leather shoes clicking in unison against the Italian marble. They walked directly to the center of the room, stopping exactly 3 feet in front of where Josephine Caldwell stood in her midnight sapphire silk. The blaring of the lockdown sirens suddenly cut off, plunging the room into a heavy, ringing silence. The crimson emergency strobe stopped, and the warm, golden hour light filtered back through the rain-slicked windows. In the sudden, suffocating quiet, Harrison and his entire legion of ruthless, high-powered attorneys walked right past Conrad and bowed their heads in unison to Josephine. The heavy, ringing silence in the penthouse lobby was absolute. It was the kind of profound, devastating quiet that follows a catastrophic earthquake, when the dust is still suspended in the air and the survivors have not yet realized the ground beneath their feet is entirely gone. Conrad Montgomery stood frozen, his manicured hands hovering uselessly in the space between himself and his $50 million legal team. His brain, usually so adept at twisting reality to suit his massive ego, completely short-circuited. He watched Harrison, the most ruthless, feared corporate attorney on the Eastern Seaboard, hold his deep, deferential bow toward the quiet woman in the vintage sapphire silk dress. The 5 towering associates flanking Harrison mirrored the exact angle of submission. Harrison, Conrad choked out, his voice a pathetic, reedy rasp that completely lacked its usual booming authority. What in the hell are you doing? Have you lost your mind? Get up. I pay your retainer. You work for me. Harrison did not flinch. He slowly straightened his posture, his cold, gray eyes remaining locked respectfully on Josephine Caldwell. He did not spare a single glance for the billionaire desperately shouting behind him. To Harrison, Conrad was already a ghost, an evaporated asset in a building he no longer controlled. Hold on, because what happened next even I did not see coming. The sheer scale of the legal machinery Josephine had assembled in the shadows was breathtaking. I asked you a question, Conrad roared, his aristocratic mask entirely shattering, replaced by the red-faced panic of a cornered animal. He lunged forward, grabbing Harrison by the shoulder of his immaculate, obsidian suit. You are fired. Do you hear me? I will have you disbarred. I will ruin your entire firm by tomorrow morning. Harrison simply brushed Conrad's trembling hand off his shoulder with the casual disdain one might use to flick away a dead insect. He still did not look at the billionaire. Josephine watched the pathetic display of Conrad's collapsing empire with absolute, chilling pity. She did not smile. She did not gloat. Her dignity was an impenetrable fortress. She had waited her entire life for this exact moment, enduring the shadows, preserving her family's truth while men like Conrad paraded across her ancestral land as if they owned it. She had watched him mock her clothing, degrade her character, and kick her family's legacy across the cold marble floor. She said nothing. She did not need to. The silence she gave him then was the most expensive thing he had ever received. With a slow, deliberate movement, Josephine lowered her chin just a fraction of an inch, acknowledging the legal team. It was the subtle, elegant permission of a queen holding court. In perfect synchronization, Harrison stepped forward, closing the final 3 feet between them. He did not hand her a legal brief. He did not produce a standard contract. Instead, with a reverence that made old Arthur whimper from his place on the floor, the lead attorney stepped forward and handed Josephine a heavy, velvet-bound crimson folder. The crimson folder was breathtaking. It was bound in centuries-old crushed velvet, its edges capped in dark, unpolished silver. A heavy silver clasp, intricately molded into the shape of 2 overlapping oak leaves, held the folio tightly shut. It was an object that radiated ancient, undeniable power, looking entirely out of place amidst the sterile, modern glass and steel of the Montgomery Tower. Conrad's breathing became ragged, his chest heaving under his charcoal Brioni suit. The cloying scent of his expensive jasmine cologne was rapidly being overpowered by the sour, sharp stench of his own panicked sweat. He stared at the velvet folio, his mind desperately clawing for an explanation that did not end in his absolute destruction. "What is that?" Conrad demanded, his voice cracking violently. He took a stumbling step backward, suddenly terrified of the object resting in Josephine's elegant hands. "Is this a joke? Is this some kind of extortion attempt? Because I swear to God, I will bury all of you. He thought he had won, but this decision to continue threatening her would haunt him for the rest of his life. Josephine did not look at him. She held the heavy folio with the quiet reverence of a woman holding the beating heart of her family's legacy. Slowly, she reached up to her collarbone. Her slender fingers grasped the antique silver key that rested against her pale skin. For the first time since she had walked into the freezing lobby, her expression shifted. The profound pity in her dark eyes melted into a devastating, ironclad certainty. She unclasped the delicate chain, sliding the dark silver key free. Arthur, still slumped against the Italian marble, let out a wet, strangled sob. He pressed his hands over his face, unable to watch the execution he had always known was coming. He knew what was inside that folder. He knew exactly what that key unlocked. The lobby was so quiet that the heavy, freezing rain lashing against the floor-to-ceiling windows sounded like breaking glass. Every junior executive, every terrified board member, held their breath as Josephine inserted the antique silver key into the heavy clasp of the crimson folder. Click! The sound of the ancient lock turning echoed through the cavernous penthouse lobby with the finality of a judge's gavel. Josephine smoothly flipped the heavy velvet cover open. The folio did not contain a lawsuit. It did not contain a demand for money. Nestled against the dark silk interior, perfectly preserved and radiating an authority that made the Montgomery Corporation look like a temporary sandcastle, sits the original, century-old deed to the land Montgomery Tower was built upon. The heavy vellum of the deed rested under the golden hour light, its thick black ink and massive wax seal identical to the document Conrad had so arrogantly kicked across the floor just moments earlier. But this was the original. This was the master document that dictated the fate of every square inch of concrete, steel, and glass within a 10-block radius. Conrad stared at the exposed document, his vision swimming. The edges of his world were beginning to blur and darken. He tried to speak, tried to formulate a legal defense, a threat, a bribe, anything to stop the walls from closing in. But before a single word could leave his trembling lips, the heavy, gold-plated doors of the private executive elevator chimed open once again. Footsteps. Frantic, entirely undignified footsteps slapped against the pristine marble. It was Gideon, the chief financial officer of the Montgomery Corporation. He was a man who usually moved with the slow, calculated arrogance of someone who controlled billions of dollars. Now he was sprinting. His silk tie was violently askew. His thinning hair was plastered to his forehead with cold sweat, and he was clutching a sleek titanium tablet to his chest as if it were a shield. Conrad! Gideon screamed, his voice breaking entirely as he slid across the marble floor, nearly colliding with one of the terrified junior executives. Conrad, you have to look at this. Right now. Conrad spun around, desperate for a distraction, desperate for an ally. Gideon, thank God. Call the banks. Call the federal regulators. These people are trying to pull a hostile takeover with forged historical documents. No, you don't understand. Gideon interrupted, practically weeping as he grabbed Conrad by the lapels of his $5,000 suit. It was a staggering breach of protocol, an action that would normally have resulted in his immediate termination. He would understand later. Much later, when it was already too late. Gideon shoved the glowing titanium tablet directly into Conrad's face. The screen was flashing with dozens of high-priority banking alerts, all painted in the exact same shade of catastrophic red as the lockdown strobes from minutes earlier. They're gone, Conrad, Gideon whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. The offshore accounts, the liquid assets, the corporate treasury, every single cent. Conrad froze, his blood turning entirely to ice. What do you mean, gone? We have $4 billion in liquid capital. Gideon slowly turned his head. His terrified, bloodshot eyes moved past Conrad, past the legion of bowing attorneys, and locked onto the quiet woman standing in the bespoke midnight sapphire dress. Not anymore, Gideon breathed, his voice hollow and empty. The CFO slowly released Conrad's lapels and took 2 staggering steps backward, his knees buckling until he sank to the floor right beside old Arthur. The CFO looks at Josephine in absolute, pale-faced terror. Conrad Montgomery was a man accustomed to the absolute obedience of the universe. When he snapped his fingers, fortunes were transferred across oceans. When he raised his voice, politicians altered their legislation. He had spent his entire 45 years encased in an impenetrable bubble of wealth and inherited power, completely insulated from the concept of consequences. But as he stared at his chief financial officer weeping on the freezing Italian marble, and his $50 million legal team bowing to a woman he had just degraded, that bubble violently popped. The scent of expensive jasmine cologne in the penthouse lobby was entirely replaced by the sharp, acidic tang of primal, unadulterated fear. The junior executives, the wolves who had been laughing at Conrad's cruel jokes just minutes earlier, were now backing away, pressing themselves against the mahogany-paneled walls as if trying to merge with the architecture. Conrad refused to accept the reality unfolding in front of him. His ego, fragile and massive, violently rejected the narrative. He was the billionaire. He was the king of the glass tower. This woman in the vintage sapphire silk was an anomaly, a glitch in his perfect world that simply needed to be forcefully removed. Enough, Conrad roared, his voice tearing at his throat. He completely abandoned any pretense of aristocratic composure. He reached down and slapped his hand against the heavy silver intercom panel on the boardroom desk, his fingers trembling with blind rage. Security Team Alpha, get up here right now. I have a hostile trespasser on the 75th floor. Bring the tactical restraints. He thought he had won, but this decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. Josephine Caldwell did not flinch at his screaming. She simply watched him, her dark eyes completely empty of fear, reflecting only the flashing lightning from the storm raging outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. She stood beside the legion of obsidian-suited attorneys, the antique silver key resting warmly against her collarbone, radiating an ancient, quiet authority. Heavy, hurried footsteps echoed from the private stairwell. The thick mahogany doors burst open, and 6 massive men in tactical black uniforms poured into the penthouse lobby. They were Conrad's elite, ex-military private security detail, the men he paid millions to brutalize anyone who threatened his empire. Finally, Conrad spat, pointing a violently shaking finger directly at Josephine's calm face. His bespoke Brioni suit was rumpled, his face flushed and ugly, mottled red. Grab her. I want her in handcuffs, and I want her thrown onto the street like the trash she is. Do it now. The tactical guards moved with lethal, trained precision. They surged forward into the room, their hands resting instinctively on their heavy utility belts, their eyes scanning for the threat. But as the chief of security, a grizzled veteran who had commanded the tower for 25 years, stepped past the terrified junior executives, he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes locked onto the woman in the midnight sapphire dress. He recognized her face from the biometric override sequence that had bypassed the entire building's mainframe 30 minutes earlier. He recognized the profound, untouchable power she carried. The security guards stepped into the room, but they did not lunge for Josephine. Instead, the chief of security raised a single, commanding fist, halting his men. In complete defiance of the screaming billionaire behind them, the massive tactical guards stood down, lowered their hands, and looked directly to Josephine for their orders. The sight of his own elite security force refusing his direct command was the final, devastating blow to Conrad's fracturing sanity. It was as if the laws of gravity had suddenly ceased to function within the Montgomery Tower. The very men he paid to protect his manufactured throne had instantly recognized who the true sovereign of the land was, and it was not the man screaming until his throat bled. Conrad stumbled backward, his polished Italian leather shoes slipping slightly on the pristine marble floor. His breathing was rapid and shallow, his chest heaving under the expensive charcoal wool of his suit. He looked at the guards standing in respectful silence. He looked at the 5 towering corporate attorneys still flanking Josephine. He looked at old Arthur and Gideon, his most trusted advisors, both weeping openly on the floor beside the heavy cream vellum of the original, century-old deed. Little did he know, the words she was about to speak would not just strip him of his company. They would erase his entire legacy from the city's skyline within 72 hours. The heavy, antique grandfather clock in the corner of the grand lobby ticked with a slow, relentless rhythm, the brass pendulum slicing through the suffocating silence. Outside the glass, the freezing rain continued to batter the city, washing the streets clean. Conrad's aristocratic face twisted into a mask of pure, frantic desperation. He had absolutely nothing left to throw at her. His money was frozen. His lawyers had defected. His security force had abandoned him. All he had left was his fragile, toxic pride, and he clung to it like a drowning man clutching a razor blade. He stalked toward Josephine, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were bone white. The junior executives held their breath, terrified he might actually resort to physical violence. But as he stepped within 3 feet of her, he stopped. He could not bring himself to cross the invisible, terrifying boundary of her quiet dignity. She possessed a terrifying, elegant certainty that completely paralyzed him. "Who do you think you are?" Conrad screamed, the question tearing from his lungs, a desperate, broken sound that echoed off the high, golden-lit walls. His voice cracked with sheer terror. "You walk into my building. You hack my accounts. You bribe my lawyers. Who are you?" Josephine Caldwell did not raise her voice. She did not match his frantic, chaotic energy. She simply looked at him, her dark eyes pinning him to the spot like a butterfly on a mounting board. She let the silence stretch for one agonizing, endless moment, allowing the absolute terror of his situation to fully saturate his bones. She gently closed the heavy velvet cover of the crimson folio, the antique silver clasp clicking shut with a sound of utter finality. She smoothed the bespoke midnight sapphire silk of her dress, her movements slow, deliberate, and devastatingly calm. When she finally spoke, her voice was a velvet scalpel, quiet but impossibly sharp, carrying effortlessly to every single corner of the cavernous lobby. "I am not your applicant, Conrad," Josephine said, the words falling from her lips with the weight of 100 years of buried history. "I am your landlord, and your father's 99-year lease expired at midnight." The sentence struck Conrad with the physical force of a speeding freight train. The immediate, visceral reaction was catastrophic. Conrad's knees violently buckled beneath him. The arrogant sneer that had defined his face for 45 years was completely wiped away, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood drained entirely from his face, his skin turning a sickening, translucent gray. He gasped for air, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, but his lungs refused to expand. The realization of what those words truly meant, the forfeiture clause, the loss of the tower, the absolute destruction of the Montgomery name, crushed him instantly, leaving him pale, trembling, and utterly destroyed. The deafening silence that followed Josephine's declaration was heavier than the concrete foundation of the tower itself. The words hung in the frigid, heavily conditioned air, vibrating with an ancient, inescapable truth. The tension that had been building since she first stepped off the gold-plated elevator had finally, violently snapped, unleashing a wave of absolute devastation upon the man who thought he owned the world. Old Arthur, who had been kneeling on the Italian marble in a state of hyperventilating panic, finally reached his physical limit. The sheer scale of the Montgomery family's defeat, a secret he had guarded with his life for 4 decades, completely overwhelmed his fragile heart. With a soft, pathetic groan, the elderly board member's eyes rolled back, and he officially fainted, collapsing fully against the cold stone floor. No one moved to help him. The junior vice presidents were too paralyzed by their own impending ruin to care about the old man. They were staring at Josephine with the wide, terrified eyes of prey who had just realized they were locked inside a cage with an apex predator.
Conrad remained frozen in his half-crouched position, his knees still buckled, his pale face slick with a cold, terrified sweat. His mind was desperately trying to stitch his shattered reality back together. He forced out a laugh. It was a horrible, jagged sound, entirely devoid of humor, scraping painfully against his throat. "It's a prank," Conrad gasped, his voice cracking so severely he sounded like a frightened child. He looked wildly around the room, begging his defected legal team and his frozen security guards to agree with him. "This is a pathetic, elaborate prank. A lease? A landlord? My grandfather built this company from the ground up. We own everything." He thought he had won, but his delusion was simply the final defense mechanism of a collapsing ego. Harrison, the towering, $50 million senior attorney, slowly turned his head to look at the broken billionaire. His gray eyes were devoid of any sympathy or warmth. "It is not a prank, Conrad," Harrison said, his deep voice devoid of emotion, echoing through the silent lobby. The original land deed signed in 1925 was a temporary commercial lease, contingent on a 99-year maturation date. You failed to renegotiate. You failed to vacate. You are currently trespassing on the private estate of the Caldwell family." Conrad's breath hitched. He looked from Harrison's cold face to the heavy velvet folio resting in Josephine's elegant hands. His world was spinning out of control. "And per the penal stipulations of the original contract," Harrison continued, his words cutting through Conrad's remaining sanity like a blade, "overstaying the lease results in the immediate, non-negotiable forfeiture of all physical and liquid assets housed upon the property." Conrad tried to speak, but only a dry, rattling wheeze escaped his lips. Harrison was not finished. "You do not own this building, Conrad. You do not own the money in the vault. And as of midnight last night," the attorney stated, stepping forward to deliver the final, devastating blow, "you do not even own the chair you sit in." Harrison's devastating words hung in the air, a final verdict delivered without a shred of emotion. The reality of the 99-year lease and the catastrophic failure to vacate began to suffocate the room. Conrad stammered, his mind violently rejecting the truth, frantically trying to deny the existence of a document his own grandfather had signed. Harrison did not argue with the broken billionaire. He simply turned away, his immaculate obsidian suit catching the dim light, and walked toward the massive mahogany boardroom console at the center of a lobby. He tapped a sequence onto the sleek glass control panel. Instantly, the towering, floor-to-ceiling windows behind them began to automatically darken as heavy velvet blackout blinds descended with a quiet, expensive hum, blocking out the freezing rain and the city skyline. From the ceiling above, 3 massive, state-of-the-art OLED projection screens silently glided down into place. Harrison's lead associate, a woman with eyes as sharp and cold as cut glass, stepped forward and connected a secure titanium drive to the console. The screens flared to life. They did not display the Montgomery Corporation's quarterly earnings or global market shares. They displayed high-resolution, digitized scans of the original Caldwell estate deed. Conrad's breath hitched violently in his throat. He watched, completely paralyzed, as the pages scrolled past in towering, illuminated detail. The century-old legal text was terrifyingly clear. Article 4, Section 12 of the Primary Lease Agreement, Harrison stated, his voice booming effortlessly through the darkened, silent room. The associate tapped a key, and a specific paragraph on the center screen was highlighted in a glowing, devastating crimson. Conrad's eyes darted frantically across the text. His lips moved soundlessly as he read the archaic, brutal legal phrasing. It was a poison pill, buried so deep within the foundation of the company that 3 generations of Montgomery men had entirely forgotten it existed. Or perhaps they had simply chosen to ignore it, blinded by their own unchecked arrogance. He thought he had won, but this decision to ignore his family's buried sins would haunt him for the rest of his life. Upon the expiration of the 99-year term, Harrison read aloud, forcing Conrad to hear the words he was desperately trying to unsee. Should the tenant fail to vacate the premises by the stroke of midnight, a punitive forfeiture clause is immediately enacted. The junior executives, huddled together in the shadows like frightened sheep, leaned forward to read the towering screens. They were watching the absolute, systematic destruction of their billionaire boss in real time. "The penalty clause dictates," Harrison continued, his tone entirely flat and merciless, "the immediate, unconditional forfeiture of all physical structures, intellectual property, and liquid assets housed within the boundaries of the Caldwell estate." The words slammed into Conrad like physical blows. The ultimate penalty clause for overstaying was finally revealed: the immediate forfeiture of all assets within the building. Conrad's perfectly manicured hands began to shake violently. The $5,000 charcoal Brioni suit suddenly felt like a straitjacket, suffocating him in the dim, crimson-lit room. The reality of the forfeiture clause was absolute, undeniable, and currently projected on a 100-inch screen for every one of his senior executives to witness. He was not just being evicted from his tower, he was being entirely erased from the billionaire class. Panic, raw and unfiltered, finally shattered the last remaining fragments of his aristocratic persona. He refused to be stripped of his wealth by a quiet woman in a vintage silk dress. He was a Montgomery. He had senators on his private payroll. He had offshore bankers who moved mountains of gold with a single, hushed phone call. With a frantic, desperate gasp, Conrad shoved his trembling hand into the breast pocket of his jacket and yanked out his encrypted satellite phone. His fingers fumbled clumsily over the screen, smearing cold sweat across the glass as he actively bypassed his domestic accounts, knowing they were already compromised, and dialed his most secure, heavily guarded private banker in the Cayman Islands. Meanwhile, across the city, his status-obsessed fiancée was making the biggest mistake of her entire life, blissfully unaware that the corporate empire she was marrying into was currently burning to the ground. Conrad pressed the phone hard against his ear, his eyes darting wildly around the room like a cornered animal. Josephine Caldwell watched him with an expression of profound, devastating pity. She did not try to stop him. She did not order her massive, tactical security guards to confiscate the phone. The silence she gave him then was the most expensive thing he had ever received. "Pick up, pick up, pick up," Conrad muttered frantically under his breath, taking a staggering step away from the towering screens. The encrypted line clicked, and the call connected. Conrad let out a jagged, pathetic sob of relief, his shoulders slumping. "David. Thank God. Listen to me very carefully. We are under a hostile cyber attack. I need you to initiate Protocol Omega immediately. Move the entire $4 billion in the primary liquid reserves to the Zurich Ghost accounts. Do it right now." He waited for his banker's panicked compliance. He waited for the confirmation that his vast, untouchable fortune was safe from Josephine's grasp. If he had looked more carefully at Josephine's calm expression, he might have simply dropped the phone and saved himself this final, crushing humiliation. He did not look carefully. Instead of David's sycophantic voice, a cold, automated female recording echoed through the receiver, entirely void of human empathy. "Notice of federal action," the robotic voice stated clearly. Panicking, Conrad pulled the phone away from his ear, staring at the screen in sheer horror as the automated voice informed him that all of his accounts had just been frozen by federal order. The automated voice clicked dead, leaving nothing but a hollow, echoing dial tone that sounded suspiciously like a flatlining heartbeat. Conrad Montgomery's arm dropped limply to his side, all strength entirely leaving his body. The heavy, encrypted satellite phone slipped from his numb fingers. It clattered against the cold Italian marble, bouncing once before coming to rest inches from the heavy cream vellum of the original Caldwell deed. The billionaire was completely broken. His towering empire had been systematically dismantled in under an hour, without Josephine Caldwell ever once raising her voice. She had executed a masterclass in long-game revenge, delivering a quiet, inevitable justice that was absolute and inescapable. As the reality of Conrad's complete financial annihilation settled over the silent lobby, the atmosphere shifted violently. The junior vice presidents and senior board members, the exact same men who had laughed at Conrad's cruel jokes, the sycophants who had eagerly watched him kick Josephine's resume across the floor, suddenly realized they were chained to the deck of a rapidly sinking ship. Loyalty in the ultra-wealthy corporate world is entirely transactional, and Conrad Montgomery no longer possessed a single cent to purchase theirs. He lied to us," one of the vice presidents whispered, taking a slow, deliberate step away from where Conrad stood. "We had absolutely no idea," another executive chimed in, his voice trembling with sheer terror as he looked directly at Josephine and her legion of obsidian-suited attorneys. "We thought he owned the land. We are just employees. We had nothing to do with this." Conrad slowly turned his head, his pale, sweat-slicked face twisting in profound disbelief. The exact same board members who had laughed at Josephine's humiliation now turned on him instantly. Like rats fleeing a burning building, they scrambled frantically to distance themselves from the toxic, radioactive ruin of their former king. "You cowards," Conrad rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "I made you. I made all of you rich." They did not listen to him. They surged forward, completely ignoring Conrad, stepping right over the unconscious body of old Arthur and threw themselves at the feet of the true landowner. They fell to their knees on the freezing marble, their expensive Italian suits wrinkling as they looked up at Josephine Caldwell. They wept. They begged. They frantically offered to testify against Conrad in federal court. They offered to hand over all his private ledgers and expose his buried secrets. Josephine looked down at the pathetic display of corporate groveling. She did not smile. She did not raise her voice to accept their surrender. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her dark eyes were as cold and unforgiving as the freezing rain lashing against the glass outside. They fell to their knees, begging Josephine for mercy. She offered none. The groveling of the senior executives echoed pathetically through the darkened, crimson-lit penthouse lobby. These were men who earned millions of dollars a year, who dined at Michelin-starred restaurants and flew on private jets, now weeping openly on the freezing Italian marble floor. They clutched at the hem of Josephine Caldwell's bespoke midnight sapphire silk dress, begging for a mercy they had never once shown to anyone else. Josephine looked down at them with an expression of profound, glacial indifference. She did not pull away, nor did she acknowledge their desperate pleas. She simply stood perfectly still, her dignity an impenetrable fortress against their chaos. The antique silver key resting against her collarbone caught the dim light, a quiet testament to a century of waiting. She said nothing. She did not need to. The silence she gave them then was the most terrifying answer they could have possibly received. With a subtle, almost imperceptible shift of her gaze, Josephine looked toward Harrison, the towering lead attorney standing faithfully at her side. Harrison gave a sharp, definitive nod. He reached into his immaculate, custom-tailored obsidian suit jacket. He did not pull out another devastating legal brief. He did not withdraw a pen or a phone. With a slow, deliberate motion that felt almost theatrical in its cruelty, Harrison withdrew a single, folded square of cheap, heavy-duty black plastic. He flicked his wrist, and the plastic violently snapped open. It was a standard commercial-grade trash bag. Harrison took 2 steps toward the broken billionaire, his expensive leather shoes clicking loudly against the stone. He held the open black plastic bag out toward Conrad Montgomery. "Per the eviction protocols of the Caldwell estate," Harrison stated, his deep voice entirely void of human empathy, "you are allotted precisely 3 minutes to gather your personal, non-corporate effects. Keys, company phones, and corporate credit cards remain on the desk." Conrad stared at the cheap, crinkling plastic. It was the ultimate symbol of degradation, an object so utterly pedestrian that it violently offended his status-obsessed mind. He had never touched a trash bag in his entire 45 years of life. His massive, fragile ego violently ruptured. If he had looked more carefully at her expression, he might have simply taken the bag and preserved whatever tiny fraction of dignity he had left. He did not look carefully. "I am not touching that," Conrad shrieked, his voice tearing into a hysterical, jagged register. The mask of the sophisticated CEO was entirely gone, replaced by a throwing, infantile tantrum. He lunged toward the heavy mahogany boardroom console, violently sweeping his arm across the surface. Crystal decanters, heavy gold pens, and stack of financial reports shattered against the floor in a chaotic explosion of glass and paper. He kicked at the wreckage, his face mottled purple with uncontrollable rage. He was completely unraveling, throwing a violent, undignified tantrum in front of the very men he used to command, refusing to accept the cheap plastic bag of his ruin. The sound of shattering crystal and Conrad's hysterical screaming failed to provoke a single flinch from Josephine Caldwell. She watched his complete psychological collapse with the clinical, detached observation of a scientist studying an insect under a microscope. Her poise was absolute, throwing his chaotic, deeply embarrassing display into sharp, humiliating relief. Panting heavily, his $5,000 Brioni suit stained with spilled scotch and sweat, Conrad desperately lunged for the heavy, multi-line corporate phone sitting securely on the surviving edge of the mahogany desk. His encrypted cell phone was dead, his accounts were frozen, but he still believed he had physical allies in the city. He still believed his money had bought him a shield. Meanwhile, across the city, he was making the biggest mistake of his entire life, entirely unaware that the federal judges who had signed the transfer orders had already dispatched the authorities to secure the tower's perimeter. Conrad's trembling, manicured fingers slammed against the keypad, dialing a direct, unlisted number for the city's chief of police, a man Conrad had personally kept on a highly illegal, highly lucrative retainer for over a decade. Miller. Conrad barked into the receiver the second the line connected, his voice cracking with sheer desperation. Chief Miller, get a tactical squad to the 75th floor of my tower immediately. I have a hostile trespasser. She has forged documents and corrupted my security team. Arrest her. Arrest all of them. He slammed the phone down, chest heaving, a frantic, triumphant smile stretching across his pale, sweat-slicked face. He looked at Josephine, pointing a violently shaking finger at her. You are done. You hear me? The police are on their way. You're going to be dragged out of here in chains. This decision to invite the authorities into the room would haunt him for the rest of his life. Less than 60 seconds later, the heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse lobby burst open. The heavy, authoritative thud of heavy boots striking the Italian marble echoed through the room. A squad of uniformed city police officers marched in, their hands resting cautiously on their belts. Leading them was not the corrupt Chief Miller, but a stern, decorated precinct captain whom Conrad had never been able to buy. Captain, Conrad shouted, rushing forward, his arms wide. Thank God. Arrest this woman immediately for corporate espionage and trespassing. The captain did not even look at Conrad. He marched straight past the frantic billionaire, his boots crunching over the shattered crystal on the floor. He walked directly to the center of the room, stopping squarely in front of Josephine Caldwell in her breathtaking sapphire silk dress. The room fell dead silent. The groveling executives on the floor held their breath. With sharp, crisp precision, the police captain snapped his arm up and delivered a flawless, respectful salute to Josephine. He lowered his hand and spoke, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of the storm outside. The perimeter is secure, Miss Caldwell. The federal transfer is complete, the captain stated, entirely ignoring the gasping billionaire behind him. Do you need this trespasser forcefully escorted off your property? The final thread of Conrad Montgomery's sanity definitively snapped. The sight of a decorated police captain saluting the woman he had mocked just an hour earlier completely short-circuited his brain. He stumbled backward, his polished Italian leather shoes slipping on the wet marble until his spine collided heavily against the thick, reinforced glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. He was trapped. There was no money left to freeze, no lawyers left to fire, and no corrupt officials left to call. The towering glass monolith he had ruled like a ruthless dictator had been seamlessly, legally reclaimed by its rightful owner. No, Conrad whispered, his voice entirely devoid of its booming authority, reduced to a pathetic, hollow rasp. He looked at the heavy black trash bag still resting on the floor where Harrison had dropped it. You can't do this. I am a Montgomery. I use the private subterranean exit. You cannot march me out of the front doors. He thought he had won, but he was about to discover that Josephine's justice was not meant to be a quiet, private affair. Her justice demanded witnesses. Josephine took a slow, deliberate step forward. The bespoke vintage silk of her dress shifted like dark water. She looked at Conrad, her dark eyes completely unreadable, radiating a quiet, terrifying power. You do not dictate the terms of your departure from my property, Conrad, Josephine said, her voice a soft, velvet blade that effortlessly commanded the massive room. You degraded my family's legacy in front of your board. You dropped my resume on the floor to entertain your sycophants. Your exit will be exactly as public as your arrogance. Conrad's stomach violently dropped. A cold, nauseating dread pooled in his gut as he realized exactly what she was planning. "Please," Conrad begged, the word tearing painfully from his throat. The arrogant bully was finally, completely broken, entirely stripped of his status, and pleading with the silent powerhouse he had so deeply underestimated. "Please, just let me take the service elevator. Let me leave through the garage." "Harrison," Josephine said softly, never taking her eyes off Conrad's pale, sweating face. The towering lead attorney stepped forward and pressed a button on the mahogany console. The heavy, gold-plated doors of the penthouse's central, transparent glass elevator, the one that faced the massive, open-air atrium of the entire building, chimed and smoothly slid open. Little did he know, the ultimate humiliation was waiting exactly 74 floors below. "The entire Montgomery Corporation staff," Harrison announced, his cold voice echoing over the sound of the freezing rain, "has been ordered by the new ownership to halt all operations. They have been gathered in the main lobby downstairs." Conrad slowly turned his head, looking through the open doors of the glass elevator. It offered a completely unobstructed, transparent view of the entire descent. Everyone in the building would see him. Every intern he had screamed at, every receptionist he had degraded, every manager he had fired, they were all waiting at the bottom to watch the billionaire fall. The transparent walls of the central glass elevator offered absolutely no place to hide. It was a suspended cage of absolute humiliation, dropping smoothly through the massive, open-air atrium of the Montgomery Tower. Conrad Montgomery, the man who had spent 45 years meticulously curating an image of untouchable, ruthless power, was now holding a cheap, black plastic trash bag filled with nothing but his car keys and a shattered ego. His $5,000 charcoal Brioni suit was stained with spilled scotch and violently rumpled. The cloying scent of his expensive jasmine cologne had entirely soured, replaced by the sharp, undeniable stench of a man who had lost everything. He stood rigidly in the center of the glass box, his pale, sweat-slicked face pressed toward the polished doors, entirely unable to look at the floors blurring past him. Meanwhile, down on the ground floor, the entire corporate machinery of the tower had ground to an unprecedented, absolute halt. 74 floors of employees, from the highest-paid senior partners to the newest mailroom interns, had been ordered from their desks. They stood shoulder to shoulder, lining the expansive, multi-tiered balconies that overlooked the central atrium. They were entirely silent. There was no whispering, no pointing, no laughing. There was only the cold, collective gaze of 1,000 people watching the slow, agonizing descent of their former tyrant. Conrad's breathing was rapid and shallow, his hot breath fogging the cold glass of the elevator. Every time the carriage passed a floor, he felt the physical weight of their stairs pressing against his skin. These were the people he had screamed at. These were the people he had degraded to entertain his board. He had treated them like disposable assets, entirely convinced they were utterly beneath him. He thought he had won, but this slow, public exhibition of his ruin would haunt him for the rest of his life. The elevator hummed with an expensive, quiet efficiency, completely indifferent to the psychological torture of the man trapped inside. Conrad's knuckles were bone-white as he gripped the thin plastic of the trash bag, the crinkling sound deafening in the enclosed space. He tried to close his eyes, tried to retreat into the arrogant, insulated reality he had always known, but the heavy silence of the building was too profound. As the glass cage finally descended past the mezzanine level and into the grand, Italian marble lobby, a new, entirely unexpected terror seized him. Through the towering, floor-to-ceiling glass doors at the front entrance of the building, Conrad could see the flashing crimson lights of a police barricade. The heavy, freezing rain was still lashing the city streets, but the wet pavement was illuminated by the harsh, strobing glare of a dozen high-powered television cameras. The press had arrived. The news of the hostile takeover, the sudden freezing of billions in liquid assets, and the exposure of the expired Caldwell lease had leaked to the financial networks with lethal, undeniable speed. The glass doors of the elevator chimed, a soft, pleasant sound that echoed like a death knell through the completely silent lobby. The doors smoothly slid open, exposing Conrad Montgomery to the waiting world. The cold, heavily conditioned air of the ground floor lobby hit Conrad like a physical blow as he stepped out of the glass elevator. He was flanked by the unsmiling, decorated police captain and two heavily armed officers. They did not touch him. They did not need to. Conrad's legs were trembling so violently that he could barely put one polished Italian leather shoe in front of the other. The silence of the 1,000 employees gathered in the lobby was suffocating. They parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide, agonizingly long pathway from the elevator directly to the massive revolving glass doors. Conrad walked the gauntlet, his head bowed, the cheap black plastic trash bag crinkling loudly in his shaking grip. He did not look up. He could not bear to meet the eyes of the people he had ruthlessly terrorized. The profound, quiet dignity that Josephine Caldwell possessed, the quiet strength that had so deeply intimidated him, was entirely absent in his own spirit. He was completely hollow, a fragile shell of a man entirely defined by a bank account that no longer existed. As he reached the massive glass doors, the automated sensors triggered, sliding the heavy panels open and allowing the freezing, bitter wind to howl into the lobby. The moment Conrad stepped over the threshold and out onto the wet concrete of the plaza, the world erupted. A blinding wall of white light exploded against his retinas as dozens of camera flashes fired in rapid succession. The harsh, unnatural glare illuminated his pale, terrified face and his stained, ruined suit for the entire world to see. Microphones were violently thrust over the police barricades. Reporters from every major financial network screamed questions over the roaring wind and the freezing rain, their voices a chaotic, deafening chorus of his absolute destruction. Conrad, are the reports of the federal asset freeze true? Mr. Montgomery, did you know the Caldwell lease had expired? Conrad, look this way. Are you facing federal fraud charges? He squeezed his eyes shut, raising a trembling hand to shield his face from the blinding flashbulbs. He stumbled down the wide granite steps, the icy rain instantly plastering his expensive haircut to his forehead and soaking through the thin wool of his suit. He was shivering violently, completely disoriented by the noise and the blinding lights. Little did he know, the cameras were not the most devastating thing waiting for him in the freezing rain. As he reached the bottom of the steps, shivering and clutching his plastic bag, the sea of reporters shifted. Standing perfectly still just beyond the barricade, entirely ignoring the rain ruining her designer coat, was Victoria. She was his fiancée, a woman whose entire existence revolved around social status, exclusive galas, and the unlimited power of the Montgomery credit card. She had not come to comfort him. She had not come to stand by his side in his darkest hour. Conrad gasped, a pathetic, broken sound tearing from his throat. He took a stumbling step toward her, his eyes pleading. Victoria, he choked out over the noise of the press. Victoria, please. She did not reach out to him. Her perfectly manicured face twisted into an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. The blinding flash of the press cameras illuminated Victoria's face in sharp, unforgiving bursts of white light. Conrad reached his trembling, freezing hand out toward her across the wet pavement, desperate for a single tether to his former life. He believed, in his fractured, panicked mind, that she still loved him. He believed that the enormous, flawless diamond resting on her left hand meant she would stand by him through the storm. He would understand later, much later, when it was already too late. Loyalty in Victoria's world, much like the loyalty of Conrad's boardroom, was a commodity purchased entirely with power and wealth. And Conrad's accounts were currently reading zero. Victoria looked at his soaked, ruined Brioni suit. She looked at the cheap black plastic trash bag clutched in his other hand. Her eyes, cold and entirely devoid of empathy, slowly traveled up to his pale, pathetic face. She did not say a single word to him. She did not need to. The absolute revulsion radiating from her rigid posture was louder than the screaming reporters surrounding them. With a slow, deliberate movement, Victoria raised her left hand. The The blinding glare of a television camera caught the massive platinum engagement ring, fracturing the light into 100 sharp, icy prisms. Conrad's breath hitched. "No," he whispered, the freezing rain running into his eyes, mixing with his hot, humiliating tears. "Victoria, don't. I can fix this. I can call the governor." She did not even blink. With her right hand, she smoothly grasped the heavy platinum band and pulled it off her finger. She held it out over the freezing, rain-slicked concrete. She did not throw it at his chest. She did not hand it back to him. With the casual, detached disdain of a queen discarding a piece of trash, she simply opened her manicured fingers. The heavy diamond ring fell. It hit the wet concrete pavement with a sharp, sickening clink that somehow cut entirely through the chaotic noise of the storm and the shouting press. It bounced once, spinning slightly, before coming to rest in a shallow puddle of freezing, dirty water. Conrad let out a strangled, animalistic sob. The final remnant of his fortune, the ultimate symbol of his status, was resting in the gutter. His massive, fragile ego completely shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Completely forgetting the dozens of news cameras broadcasting his every move on live television, completely abandoning the last shred of his aristocratic pride, Conrad Montgomery fell to his knees on the freezing, rough concrete. He scrambled forward, the knees of his expensive trousers tearing against the stone, his manicured hands splashing into the freezing puddle as he desperately clawed for the ring. It was an exact, poetic mirror of the moment he had stood in the warm, golden-lit lobby and ordered Josephine Caldwell to crawl for her resume. He was now on his hands and knees, scrambling in the dirt, begging for scraps, while the entire world watched his ruin in disgust. High above him, on the 75th floor of the tower he used to own, Josephine Caldwell stood by the darkened glass windows. She watched the pathetic, shivering figure scrambling in the street below. She did not smile. She simply turned away, her family's dignity fully and permanently restored. The penthouse lobby of the newly reclaimed Caldwell Tower was a sanctuary of absolute, unshakable calm. The deafening wail of the emergency sirens had long since been silenced, and the frantic, groveling executives had been systematically escorted from the 75th floor by the newly loyal security detail. Josephine Caldwell stood alone near the center of the vast, Italian marble floor, her bespoke midnight sapphire silk dress catching the soft, golden hour light that was finally beginning to pierce through the breaking storm clouds outside. The heavy, centuries-old crimson folio rested securely on the mahogany boardroom table, its antique silver clasp locked tight. She did not celebrate. There was no champagne, no arrogant gloating, no chaotic display of triumph. True power does not need to announce itself. It simply exists. Josephine watched with quiet, measured dignity as Harrison's elite legal team began the immediate, methodical erasure of Conrad Montgomery's legacy. "The injunctions have been filed with the federal courts, Ms. Caldwell," Harrison stated, his deep voice respectful and hushed as he approached her, maintaining a polite, deferential distance. "The liquid assets are fully secured in the Caldwell estate trusts. The transition of physical property is currently underway. Arthur has been safely transferred to a private medical facility for his recovery." Josephine offered a single, elegant nod. "And the signage?" she asked, her voice a soft velvet murmur in the cavernous space. "Being handled as we speak," Harrison replied, gesturing toward the grand reception area. 3 massive men from the building's engineering team were standing on reinforced scaffolding behind the main reception desk. They held heavy steel crowbars and industrial drills. With a series of sharp, metallic cracks that echoed satisfyingly through the penthouse, they violently wrenched the massive, illuminated silver M of the Montgomery logo away from the marble wall. The heavy letter fell, crashing onto the floor where it was immediately dragged away like common scrap metal. The name that had terrorized the city for decades was being unceremoniously ripped out by the roots. The heavy brass pendulum of the antique grandfather clock swung with a slow, hypnotic rhythm, marking the first hours of a new era. Josephine turned her gaze back to the floor-to-ceiling windows. Down below, the city looked entirely different. It was no longer a board game ruled by a cruel, arrogant boy. It was her family's land, finally breathing free. The profound peace in her heart was the ultimate vindication. She had endured the shadows, the mocking, and the poverty, all to ensure this specific, beautiful silence could finally return to the 75th floor. Meanwhile, across the city, the man who used to own that name was discovering the absolute, terrifying limits of his ruin. Conrad Montgomery was no longer scrambling in the freezing puddles of the plaza. He had managed to crawl away from the blinding flashbulbs of the press and the disgusted stare of his ex-fiancée, dragging his soaked, ruined Brioni suit down a narrow, trash-strewn alleyway. He clutched his cheap black plastic bag to his chest, his entire body shaking violently from the freezing rain and the catastrophic shock of his new reality. He leaned heavily against a damp brick wall, gasping for air. He pulled his personal cell phone, the only device Harrison had permitted him to keep, from his pocket. The screen was cracked from his fall, but it still glowed in the dim, miserable light of the alley. He thought he had won, but he was about to realize that Josephine's justice reached far beyond the glass walls of the tower. Conrad desperately opened his contacts, his numb, trembling thumbs scrolling past the names of senators, billionaires, and offshore bankers who had already blocked his number. He needed a way out of the city. He needed his private jet, currently sitting on the tarmac of the exclusive executive airport just outside the city limits. If he could just get to the plane, he could flee to a jurisdiction that did not recognize the Caldwell lease. The phone buzzed violently in his frozen hand. A single, automated text message flashed across the cracked glass. Notice of repossession. Tail number N774M. Asset seized by federal mandate under the Caldwell Estate Forfeiture Clause. Aircraft grounded and secured. Conrad stared at the glowing white text until the words blurred into a meaningless smear. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the wet cobblestones. He closed his eyes, leaning the back of his head against the freezing, slime-coated brick of the alley. The cold was seeping into his bones, a deep, agonizing ache that mirrored the absolute emptiness in his chest. He was a man who had demanded the world bow to him, and now he was entirely alone in the dark, clutching a trash bag. The storm that had battered the city all afternoon showed absolutely no signs of relenting. If anything, the freezing rain fell harder, whipping through the narrow, concrete canyons of the financial district with a bitter, unforgiving malice. Conrad Montgomery stumbled out of the dark alleyway and back onto the main thoroughfare, completely unrecognizable as the billionaire CEO who had commanded a $50 million legal team just hours ago. His bespoke charcoal suit, once a symbol of his untouchable status, was now a heavy, soaked ruin that clung uncomfortably to his shivering frame. His expensive leather shoes squelched with freezing water with every agonizing step he took. The black plastic trash bag in his hand felt impossibly heavy, though it contained nothing more than a useless set of penthouse keys, a dead cell phone, and a leather wallet entirely emptied of its black titanium credit cards. He walked aimlessly, a ghost haunting the very streets he used to look down upon from his 75-story glass throne. The irony of his situation was absolute and entirely poetic. He had built his entire identity on the degradation of those he deemed beneath him. He vividly remembered firing a junior accountant right before the holidays simply because the man had brought him the wrong brand of sparkling water. He remembered laughing as his security guards violently threw protesters off the plaza steps. And now, he was quite literally in the gutter, completely invisible to the wealthy elites rushing past him under their wide, expensive umbrellas. "Excuse me," Conrad rasped, his voice a pathetic, broken whisper. He reached a trembling hand out toward a man in a sharp business suit hurrying past. "Please, my accounts are frozen. I just need a cab fare." The man did not even break his stride. He shot Conrad a look of profound disgust, sidestepping the shivering, ruined billionaire as if he were a pile of hazardous waste. "Get away from me," the businessman snapped, pulling his coat tighter and disappearing into the gray, weeping curtain of the storm. Conrad's hand dropped limply to his side. The rejection struck him harder than any physical blow. This was the world he had created. This was the exact culture of ruthless, status-obsessed cruelty he had actively fostered and rewarded in his own boardroom. He was finally experiencing the brutal, freezing reality of his own philosophy. Little did he know, this agonizing walk through the storm was simply the prelude to the final, devastating encounter of the evening. His legs finally gave out. The sheer exhaustion of his psychological collapse, combined with the biting cold, drained the last reserves of his strength. Conrad collapsed onto a wet, wooden bus bench on the corner of a busy intersection. The icy wind howled around him, biting through his ruined clothing. He wrapped his arms around his chest, violently shivering, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He looked across the street, his vision blurred by the heavy rain and his own humiliating tears. Through the downpour, he could see the towering, illuminated spire of the building he used to call his own. The flashing red lights of the police barricades were still visible at the base, but the massive silver M that used to glow at the peak of the tower was gone. It had been extinguished, completely erased from the skyline, leaving the building looking suddenly unfamiliar and utterly untouchable. He had lost everything because he could not resist the urge to mock a quiet woman in a worn charcoal coat. He had thrown her resume on the floor to entertain his sycophants, entirely blind to the antique silver key resting against her collarbone. If he had looked more carefully at her expression, he might have survived the day. He did not look carefully. Conrad pulled his knees to his chest, the cheap black plastic trash bag resting on the freezing, wet concrete next to his ruined shoes. He was completely broken. There was no anger left in him, no arrogant rage, no frantic plotting. There was only the cold, crushing weight of his own profound stupidity. He closed his eyes, wishing the freezing rain would simply wash him away entirely. The headlights of the city traffic blurred into long, sweeping streaks of yellow and white through the relentless downpour. Conrad Montgomery remained huddled on the freezing bus bench, completely paralyzed by the cold and the absolute totality of his ruin. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long, pathetic shadows across his soaked, ruined Brioni suit. He was entirely numb, his mind a blank, echoing void of defeat. Then, a smooth, deep hum cut through the chaotic noise of the storm. It was not the aggressive, roaring engine of a flashy sports car, nor the rattling cough of a city taxi. It was the quiet, impossibly heavy purr of a custom-built, ultra-luxury vehicle, an engine designed to run with absolute, unshakable silence. Conrad slowly lifted his head, his neck stiff and aching from the cold. Gliding gracefully through the freezing rain, a massive, midnight black Maybach slowed to a halt directly in front of the bus bench. The vehicle was a masterpiece of understated, generational wealth. There were no flashy chrome rims, no aggressive modifications. The paint was so deep and flawless it seemed to absorb the city lights rather than reflect them. The heavy tires sliced through the puddles with effortless grace. The luxury car idled smoothly, its heavy frame resting against the wet curb, mere feet from where the broken billionaire sat shivering. Conrad stared at the tinted, bulletproof glass of the rear passenger window. His breath hitched painfully in his chest. His fragile, shattered ego desperately sparked with one final, pathetic delusion. He convinced himself that one of his former board members, perhaps a hidden ally within the legal team, or a wealthy friend who had seen the news, had finally found their conscience. He believed someone had come back for him, ready to offer him a seat in the warm, leather-scented interior, ready to help him rebuild his empire from the ashes. He forced his freezing, trembling hands to press against the wet wooden bench, struggling to push himself up. He took a stumbling step toward the massive black car, his ruined Italian leather shoes splashing in the gutter. "Thank you," Conrad rasped, his voice a broken, desperate wheeze. He reached his shaking hand toward the polished, silver handle of the rear door. "I knew one of you would." Before his fingers could touch the metal, the heavily tinted window smoothly, silently glided down. The warm, golden light from the luxurious cabin spilled out into the freezing rain, illuminating Conrad's pale, terrified face. The interior of the car smelled faintly of expensive jasmine, rich leather, and the quiet, undeniable scent of absolute victory. Sitting in the spacious rear seat, her posture completely relaxed and radiating a profound, untouchable dignity, was Josephine Caldwell. She had not changed out of her bespoke midnight sapphire silk dress. The antique silver key still rested beautifully against her collarbone. She was wrapped in a plush, charcoal cashmere throw, completely insulated from the bitter storm raging outside. She looked at Conrad, her dark eyes completely empty of malice, anger, or vindictiveness. There was only that same, devastating, chilling pity. Conrad froze, his hand hovering uselessly in the cold air. The breath was violently knocked from his lungs. The final, pathetic delusion of his rescue shattered into dust. He was not looking at a savior. He was looking at the architect of his absolute destruction, comfortably surveying the ruins she had created. Josephine, Conrad choked out, his voice cracking so severely he sounded like he was weeping. He dropped his hand, his shoulders completely slumping in total, unconditional surrender. The arrogant bully was dead. Only a hollow, shivering shell remained. She did not smile. She did not lean forward to mock him. A quiet heroine who does not raise her voice is more terrifying to the villain than any screaming opponent. Josephine simply looked at him, absorbing the sight of the man who had ordered her to crawl on his marble floor just hours ago, now shivering in the gutter with a plastic trash bag. The silence between them stretched, heavy and profound, broken only by the rhythmic thumping of the Maybach's windshield wipers. It was a silence that confirmed her total, irreversible triumph. This decision to pause, to let him truly feel the agonizing weight of his own insignificance, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Josephine reached into the pocket of her cashmere wrap. Her movements were slow, elegant, and perfectly controlled, preparing to deliver the final, poetic blow. The freezing rain continued to lash relentlessly against the immaculate, midnight black paint of the Maybach, the storm perfectly mirroring the absolute desolation of the man standing in the gutter. Conrad Montgomery stood shivering violently, his $5,000 charcoal Brioni suit ruined and clinging to his frame like a heavy, soaked shroud. He clutched his cheap black plastic trash bag with bone-white knuckles, his chest heaving as he stared into the warm, golden-lit interior of the luxury vehicle. His eyes locked onto the woman he had so arrogantly dismissed just hours prior, desperate for any sign of mercy. Josephine Caldwell sat in perfect, unshakable silence, wrapped in a plush charcoal cashmere throw that completely insulated her from the bitter cold. The antique silver key rested beautifully against her collarbone, a quiet testament to her ultimate victory. She did not raise her voice, nor did she gloat. Her dignity was an impenetrable fortress. He thought he had won, but he would understand later, much later, that true power does not need to scream to be devastating. Josephine reached a slender, elegant hand into the pocket of her cashmere wrap. She did not withdraw a phone to record his humiliation, nor did she produce another legal document to further crush his fractured ego. Instead, her fingers emerged holding a single, dull silver coin. It was a quarter. Conrad's breath hitched, a pathetic, ragged wheeze escaping his blue lips. He watched, completely paralyzed by the sheer poetic weight of the moment, as Josephine held the coin out toward the open window. "You have lost your tower, Conrad," Josephine said, her voice a soft, velvet blade that cut effortlessly through the howling wind and freezing rain. "You have lost your fortune, your alliances, and the false legacy your grandfather built on my family's stolen land. You are now exactly what you always believed others to be, nothing." Conrad squeezed his eyes shut, his tears mixing hotly with the freezing rain. He had used words like nothing and worthless his entire life to break people, and now those exact words were his only inheritance. "Here," Josephine whispered softly. She did not throw the coin at him. With the exact, deliberate, casual disdain he had shown her in the golden-lit lobby, she simply opened her fingers. The silver quarter fell. It hit the wet concrete pavement with a sharp, sickening clink, bouncing once before coming to rest in the freezing, dirty puddle directly at the tips of his ruined Italian leather shoes. It landed in the exact spot on the wet pavement where he had forced her to watch her resume fall. "Call someone who cares," she said quietly, her dark eyes devoid of anything but absolute, chilling pity. She pressed a button on the armrest. The heavily tinted, bulletproof glass smoothly and silently glided up, severing Conrad from the warmth and light. The Maybach's heavy engine purred, and the massive vehicle pulled away from the curb, its tires slicing elegantly through the storm, leaving the broken billionaire entirely alone in the dark. The journey back to the Caldwell Tower was a quiet, profound ascension. When Josephine stepped out of the private, gold-plated elevator and back onto the 75th floor, the atmosphere had entirely transformed. The suffocating tension of Conrad's arrogance was gone, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of rain on hot concrete and a deep, generational peace. The heavy velvet blackout blinds had been raised, revealing the sprawling, glittering expanse of the city skyline beneath the breaking storm. She walked slowly across the Italian marble floor, her footsteps echoing softly in the cavernous, beautiful space. The heavy, crimson velvet folio containing the original 99-year lease rested safely on the mahogany console. She ran her fingertips gently over the silver clasp shaped like overlapping oak leaves, feeling the weight of a century of patience, survival, and quiet endurance. Her grandfather had lost this land. Her family had bled for it. But Josephine had reclaimed it without ever losing her dignity, executing a justice so poetic it could only be described as God's own hand. She approached the massive floor-to-ceiling glass windows. The freezing rain had finally stopped, and the heavy gray clouds were breaking apart, allowing the pure, clear golden light of the setting sun to wash over the city. Far below, the streets were clearing, the police barricades were being dismantled, and the world was moving on, entirely indifferent to the arrogant bully who had been erased from its ranks. She looked out over the empire that was finally, rightfully hers. She did not smile a villainous smile. She simply took a deep, unrestricted breath. The silent powerhouse had spoken exactly one sentence, and the entire world had shifted on its axis. Hold on, because the story does not end when the villain falls. It ends when the heroine finally finds her peace. Don't let this story end without the people who need it most hearing it. If you know someone who needs a reminder that patience is a weapon, that dignity is an armor, and that true justice always arrives exactly when it is meant to, share it with someone today. Stay close to this family. We have more stories where this came from, and I will be waiting right here to tell them to you.